Welcome back to the Forbes Books Podcast. Hola, I am Joe Pardavila, and when you work in podcasts long enough, inevitably two questions always come up from people. How do I make money from podcasts, and how can I get my product featured on the right podcast? I don't always have the answers, but my guest this week might. His name is Dan Granger, and he's the founder and CEO of Oxford Road, an ad agency that helps tech companies acquire thousands of customers each week using influencer endorsements on podcasts, YouTube, and more. Hello, Dan.
Hello there. Good to be with you this morning.
So, Dan, when I was doing homework on you, one headline kept popping up, and it was Dan Granger, from startup to over $1 million a month in under a year. So tell me, is this clickbait or is this all true?
That, I think, was a 2014 interview from Entrepreneur on Fire. I've never done an interview that has gotten brought back up to me more times. But I will say that, when you're talking about the business, it really was a rocket ship coming out of the gate. Now, we're actually doing numbers that are significantly better than we were at that time. But, the nice thing about Oxford Road was we were riding two waves at the same time when we started. We kind of had one foot on the direct-to-consumer tech wave, where there was just this renaissance of new brands that were sending things to consumers, allowing consumers to do things in ways they had never considered before. And we were very entrenched there. And on the other side, we were riding the podcast wave. I started kind of kicking the tires on that on the industry around 2005, 2006.
Wow.
And by the time we actually officially launched the business in 2013, we just grew really, really quickly. So we got, we were like Inc. 398, which they usually measure that on a 3-year period, but our first 2 years created that. So we really found the right pocket of the market to move into at the right time.
And so take me back to that 05 to 13 timeframe, which it was a very nascent time for podcasts. How many times did you have to describe what a podcast was to people during that time?
Way too many. Yeah, and in fact, I think people thought I was a little nutty when I was, I was like Chicken Little going like, these towers are not going to hold their value. Because I was working in radio, and that's a world But people were paying these crazy sums of money for these radio towers. And meanwhile, the internet is happening, and you start to see indications of where it's going with the blogosphere and everything like that. And so it's amazing how much you can predict in the future if you just look at the industries that move a little faster toward things and go, I wonder when we're going to be doing that. And so that's kind of what was happening. But it did take a long time for people to not only see that it might be something that some people might want to listen to, but they also, it took them a while to see dollar signs. And I kind of think of things in terms of pre-serial, post-serial, because that was when the industry kind of went from all geeks and gamers and a bunch of young tech-savvy dudes that were listening to podcasts, because it's hard to listen to them, right?
Yeah.
And then when serial came out, it was all of a sudden my neighbors are talking about podcasts, and it really opened up the reach and the appeal of the industry. And I feel like it really had legs, and the buzz, the hype has not stopped in the last 6 or 7 years as a result of that. So it's been fascinating.
It is fascinating. And what's even fascinating too is the way that sort of podcasting fit in the on-demand culture that was sort of bubbling under in the 2000s, where people all of a sudden, video on demand was basically offered to everyone if they had a cable subscription. And then all of a sudden you see the Netflixes and Hulus of the world come out, and sort of podcasts fit that space perfectly, where it was with radio, as most talent is either in morning or PM drive. So unless you were a morning person and listened to that morning show while it was on, or afternoon when you're on your commute home, that was pretty much the extent of the really sort of meaty and sticky content that people would consume. But then if you didn't listen to any of those times, you missed out on all this content. And then all of a sudden here comes podcasting, where you're like, okay, cool, I can listen to this anytime I want. I could be in my bathtub at 2:00 in the morning and I can consume a 2-hour podcast. Although I probably wouldn't suggest sitting in a bathtub for 2 hours, but still, you get what I'm saying, that now this on-demand nature was such a big part of podcast driver, don't you think?
100%. And you know what? One of the other factors is if you change the meaning of local kind of in your mind, when we worked in local radio, you had to only talk about things if you were in the spoken word category that you knew were going to be hits with like people's presets, right? You only had a limited range of topics that you could really go into and be commercially viable. What was fascinating about the fragmentation of media and podcasts being included in that is that now you could really narrowcast and build a tribe, build a community that would be larger than what you could do locally playing the hits, but you could be talking about something really, really specific. And so like one of the first indicators to me was one of my first clients ever in local radio was LegalZoom. Okay. So I started working with them in like 2004, and they're just a scrappy startup, scared out of their minds to spend $2,000 a week on an ad program. And guess what we did? Put them on a local radio show that was nationally syndicated, but it was a legal radio show called The Handle on the Law, hosted by Bill Handel, lawyer, and he endorses LegalZoom. Perfect fit, right? But you couldn't you couldn't scale that. You couldn't find a way to target programming that was talking about the subject matter that related to the product, because it never would have been commercially viable. Podcast opened that up so that now all of a sudden you could have 100 shows that you're on that are about legal concerns and really tie it in a way that you couldn't before. So we can now narrowcast to people's interests, and that's great for advertisers, and it's certainly great for consumers, and that's why part of the reason we all love it.
And so you're one of the leading podcast advertising agencies out there. And, a lot of people, because I work for Forbes Books, people are like, so how do we get advertising? How do I make money? And I always say, and I may be wrong on this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I usually say, hey, listen, if you don't have at least 100,000 downloads per episode, no advertiser will even sniff or even take a look at you. So at what point does it become viable to folks that sign up with Oxford Road to advertise on podcasts that you see a fit for an advertiser and the podcast and linking them together?
Yeah, so if you're asking about like the download threshold before you can really monetize, here's the reality. It's probably 10 to 50,000 downloads an episode. I think is where you can really start to at least like make it worth your time to charge for commercials. It depends on the show, because honestly, there are some podcasts that might get 20,000 downloads that'll get a better response than shows that have 100,000 downloads. So, there's an influence factor. There's a kind of a pull score buried underneath every show that nobody really publishes. Part of what we do as an agency is we have a database with like hundreds of millions of dollars of performance data. So we can score shows internally to know what an impression is worth. But for there to be enough impressions for it to be worth anything and even worth your time to manage it, you want to be in tens of thousands of downloads per episode, I think is a good threshold.
And, hearkening back to my radio days where I worked at a hot AC station, your key demo is adults 25-54, which, as you know, is for advertisers, it's a pretty juicy market to want to get involved with. Is there that sort of demographic breakdown in terms of who you work with? Obviously depends on the genre, but are there key demos in terms of like who's consuming these podcasts that you key in that are high value targets?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the ecosystem is pretty high value. I think it over-indexes on income, education. It's interesting if the consumer is too young to be viable for most of the products and services that we help to advertise. Usually they're old enough to have a credit card, or else they'd be, on TikTok or YouTube.
Right.
But by the time you kind of age into where podcast is really interesting to you, to the point in time where you're probably too old to want to adapt to that type of consumption behavior, where, there's always exceptions to that. But the reality is, I think it very much is 25 to 54. You're starting to see people in their 60s get more active. But people are self-selectors when they listen to podcasts as being a little bit more advanced technologically, a little bit more innovative, a little bit more open to new ideas. And that's why it's just been a dream for so many disruptive companies, so many D2C brands. That's why we've kind of really built our business around them. is because when you have new thinking about how a product can come in and disrupt part of the marketplace, and then you have a disruptive way of consuming media, pairing those two things together is a good thing. But as the industry gets more mature, we're going to crack $1 billion this year. All of a sudden, we're able to now cater to much more narrow targets. I think the audiences are getting a lot more diverse, which is great. I think that, this used to be, like I said, as geeks and gamers, it was like young dudes all the time. And so now we can target a little bit better. And there are starting to be rating services and ways to actually find out the audience compositions in ways that we didn't used to have. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny because a lot of people don't realize it's not always about the rating. It's about who's listening. If you live in a town where there's like this big AM talk station and it has your fill in the blanks, I'm not going to say who they are, and then you're like, who listens to that? Like, is that my old man listening to that? But then you realize that they have like car dealers advertising, insurance companies. So these companies know that, okay, this radio station, this talk station may be considered for old fogies or whatever you want to call them, but they're the audience I want. So I will pay an extra premium for that, even though they may not be a top 5 or top 10 station in that market. So in a way, you do that with podcasts as well, because you're dealing with such a high leverage individual, college educated, making 100K plus. All of that stuff factors into not just being about the number of listeners, correct?
Yeah, I think that is a meaningful factor. And the influence is great. Something else to remember about podcasts that's super unique as a media channel is like, where else can you get, where the medium is the message is the influencer, right? It's all comprised of influencers.
Yeah.
That's all the real estate. So you don't buy an ad that gets inserted as much. At least that's not common practice yet. It will be more so. But like when you buy an ad, it's almost assumed that the personality that is the program is going to be doing the ad for you.
Yeah.
And that's unique in a long form. It may not be unique on Instagram, although, not everything they're doing is influencer tied either. So like the trust that people have in somebody that they're going to give an hour of their time to listen to them talk is very different than what you see in other channels. And the fact that that's the whole ecosystem has made it really, really valuable.
And what's funny too is the fact that I love people who poo-poo on terrestrial radio when a lot of the facets of podcasting is straight from the terrestrial radio. It's like the live read copy that you heard your local newscaster read. That's what the podcaster's doing now. It's just so funny how so many of the elements are basically just ripped right from terrestrial right into podcasting. It's like if you probably popped on a podcast without telling someone they were listening to a podcast, they're like, oh, what radio station is this? Because it's so elementally, it's very, very, very similar and familiar.
Everything old is new again.
Yeah.
There's really not, there are parts that are entirely different. There are things that we've never seen before. And then there's parts that it's like, yeah, this is radio. And the thing I look at is like, let's remember what the job of all the people that are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire these networks is. They've got to monetize that. They've got to show a good return. And when you've got radio groups that are doing 15 to 20 minutes of commercials an hour, well, how long is it going to take before that becomes a podcast business? How long are they going to wait before they start injecting that many ad units into it? And so like we have to look down the road at radio, which has already sorted out a lot of the issues that podcast has been facing, and go, okay, we know that a lot of it's going to look like that. Hopefully some of the advancements, barriers to entry coming down, more diversity in programming, like hopefully that's going to maintain so that we all still love it. But at the end of the day, it's like the old and the new come together and are merging, and it's going to look a lot more like the old than I think people realize.
Yeah. Well, let's get a little podcast geeky. So the terminology for the ads that you hear on podcasts are predominantly pre-roll and mid-roll. Pre, obviously, before the podcast begins, and then mid-roll in the middle. And I know that some do offer post-roll. The one thing that I want to bring up to you is the fact that all of a sudden advertisers see the value in mid-roll and the importance of it. And I just want to talk to you about the user experience of this, because you've probably noticed this as well as I do. All of a sudden, there's these premiums on mid-rolls, and you have these long-form content shows, whether it's Chris Hardwick's podcast or Joe Rogan's podcast, where smack in the middle of a conversation, all of a sudden, a mid-roll from a disembodied voice pops up in the middle of the podcast. Mm-hmm. how do we stop this from turning people off? Because to me, it as a radio guy, it's a little off-putting where all of a sudden, instead of like there being a natural segue of the host saying, hey, we got to stop for a second, all of a sudden a commercial for a bed in a box pops up in the middle of the conversation, and then the bed in the box commercial ends, and then the conversation picks up. Are you worried that this obsession with getting these mid-rolls in are going to affect the product and turn some people off?
All right. Well, if we're getting clinical here, I think what you're talking about is so when you talk about a pre, mid, and a post, that's placement, which you may not have a problem with if the host finds the right moment and then seamlessly weaves in a commercial, right? But I think what you're talking about is dynamic ad insertion.
Yes.
And that's where, because it's so much more efficient to traffic these ads through and just buy digital impressions, and brands love it, and they don't have to get all involved with the talent. Like, yeah, that's the kind of crap that's gonna ruin the place. I mean, it's imagine that podcast is like this really cool bar or club that everybody was talking about. Then everybody starts going there, and they're like, "You can't go there. Everybody's going there. It's like nobody wants to be there anymore."
Yeah.
Right. So like the cool kids, it's gonna be a reckoning. If you're like so in love with podcast in the way that podcast was when you met it, a lot of that is going to change, and that's what I'm talking about. When you look at whether it's Amazon or Spotify, you look at them spending hundreds of millions of dollars for networks. Meanwhile, the value of each of all these acquisitions is greater than the total revenue of the industry. Yeah. There is so much hype around this industry, and the ROI is going to be very, very difficult to achieve in the short term. At some point, they have to go, cram more ads in there, cram more ads in there. And it's, when we started, we were talking, 1, 2, 3 live read ads an hour that a host would do. And I'm sorry, that's just not going to keep. Like, you might still have 1, 2, 3, 4 live reads an hour, but then you're going to have these breaks where you're having 5 ads at a time. Yeah. Okay, we're doing radio again. That's what we're doing. And now you got clocks. We're moving back to oversight. I mean, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about this brand safety stuff because it's a big, there's a lot of change coming. But like, this is how the West was won. Right. And it's not always pretty, and it's not always fair, and it's not always the dream that you went there for. But it is reality, and there are elements of it. And I think we have to take it all in stride.
Well, I mean, that's my concern, because as a lot of stuff you mentioned was like, this is sort of like the undoing for radio, is the fact that all of a sudden radio stations were playing, 8 to 10 minutes of commercials an hour to like 20 minutes an hour. And then they were stopping after 3 songs. And that sort of began the erosion of radio, is the fact that people are like, oh man, I'm listening to more commercials and I'm actually hearing what I want to listen to. So that's my concern in terms of like the user experience for folks, because I just went on a long road trip, and it was so weird to have be listening to like these amazing conversations, and just like out of nowhere, these dynamic ads pop in there. I mean, do you think that there's a way to, and I get where the companies are coming from. I'm not defending it either, but is there a way to make that a little more of a pleasurable experience, you think, down the road? Like, is there a way for like some of these big time podcasters to like put like a placement in it where they can be like, okay, we're gonna stop here, kind of thing?
Oh, for sure. They'll figure it out, and they're gonna find out at what point it makes you so upset that you stop listening, and they'll make sure that they only run enough ads that it's right before that amount, right? Some of it's ad load, some of it's integration practices, some of it's like, okay, is there a producer who's really stopping and thinking, how jarring is it going to be if we just start shoving irrelevant ads into the middle of a conversation? Like, I think that's going to evolve, but we have to stop at some point and recognize how young the internet is and how young these types of technologies are. And it's like, let's just remember, like, Gutenberg just came out with the printing press like 30 years ago, okay? We're still we don't have protocols for all this stuff. It's still getting worked out, and we're going to be working it out probably the rest of our natural lifetimes before we actually get a real baseline on any of this. But anyway, I think to your point, I think they'll get better at it, and I think some people are. I think some people do this better than others. But right now, it's like the rules are changing really fast. The practices are changing really fast. And I think you have to think of when they teach the class on the history of the podcast industry, you got to remember there's pre-serial, there's serial until now. And what's happened is it was all D2C brands and startups that really funded the thing to begin with. And now that they're cracking $1 billion in Madison Avenue, like big brands, big agencies, holding companies are starting to find ways in. Their job is to ruin the place. That's their whole job, is to like, give me scale, give me ease of use, give me low risk, give me infrastructure, give me validation. Whereas like, we were cowboys coming in going like, hey, look, if it works, we'll just, we don't care about ratings. We only care about the response to the ad. Like it was a very different time. And for the business to mature and to go from 1 billion in revenue to 10 billion in revenue and to start to pay back all the investments that have been made, it's going to require a lot of sacrifice and a lot of change. And I think you're rightly highlighting some of those growing pains where you go, yeah, this just ain't like it used to be. When are we going to go back to that?
Dan, I feel like it's almost like I've seen this movie before. So I guess maybe if these folks in the podcast game, maybe they don't have a lot of experience in terrestrial. So to them, this is just part of, like you said, the growing process. But to me, I've seen this movie before. I'm like, wait, this is what drove people away from radio. Don't do that same stuff again, please. I love this medium. Don't ruin it for everybody.
I gave a talk at the IAB event like 3 years ago, right when the consolidation started happening, and just kind of forecasted a little bit like, where's this going? And I used a visual of like Anna Nicole Smith and her like 93-year-old billionaire husband. They're having a baby. Like that's what's happening here. You got the old money, big corporations moving in, and you've got this like cool, future, vibrant, nascent industry trying to find its way, and they are merging. And I think that it's not going to be one or the other, and we just have to acknowledge that. I don't think it's going to be all bad. I don't think it's going to truly be like AM radio 2.0, but it is AM radio 2.0. Yeah. I mean, that's the deal. I mean, when so I went and pitched this to the Mays brothers in 2006 at an event in New York City. I brought them a pitch called Talk Radio 2.0.
Did they laugh at you?
Yeah, a little bit. They were kind. They were polite to me. Okay. Like I don't have any grievances, but they were kind of like, they had their hands full. They were trying to deal with a lot of debt and consolidation that there was so much exuberance after all of the laws changed, and they were able to just gobble up every broadcast company. Yeah, and they had to deal with all that. And so I'm talking to them about this thing that's going to be important in 10 years. And they're kind of like, yeah, that's cool. Yeah, we're working on all that. and I was like, okay, well, that's fine. And over time, I'm like, all right, I'm just going to go do my own thing because I wanted to get there a little faster. But they figured it out. And, iHeart's now doing pretty well in podcasts.
Absolutely. It's funny, being in radio at the time when podcasts started to grow, I saw the writing on the wall. I'm like, wait a minute. If like iHeart and the CBSs of the world, they're starting apps and they're doing all this, they're pushing podcasts. And of course, obviously, I know being inside that these major companies. So, hey, wait a minute. We're already paying for this talent. We don't have to pay them anymore. We're just we're going to use that talent to make the podcast. So they saw the writing on the wall for many years, and they've really leaned really hard into it over the last 5-10 years. So let's talk about some of the stuff that you do. And part of what you do involves brand marketing and brand safety, which you sort of touched upon. For folks listening not familiar with those terms, what does that mean, brand marketing and brand safety?
Well, basically, here's what it means. You're a CEO. You go to the marketing team, hey, I've been listening to this podcast and I keep hearing our competitors. How come we're not on podcasts? Right? Marketer goes, well, I love podcasts. We just didn't have a budget for it. They call the agency. They hire Oxford Road or somebody like us. Not that there's anybody like us.
Of course.
They get the agency on the phone. They go, okay, get us into podcasts. What's the least we can spend? And if it works, we're going to spend more. Right? You ever heard that one? So we go, okay, we put a plan together. We figure out, okay, what's the messaging going to be? And we use our, audiolytics process to develop, high performance creative. And then we figure out, okay, what's the right media to buy? And we go to our database of all the performance data and we go, we're going to pick these shows because we think it fits your profile and we see great performance on other advertisers that are like you. And then we go, okay, how are we going to measure the thing? So we go to market it. Right, we pick these shows, and you're the sponsor. Then the ads run, and you start measuring it, and you go, "Wow, this is really good. We're seeing like 2-to-1, 3-to-1 return on investment beyond what we're seeing on radio and A lot of times it's beating TV. And a lot of times it's keeping pace with social. And this is really cool. Plus, all my friends heard it and tell me how cool it is because they listen to this show too. Right. And then one day you're in the office. You're the marketer who got the ball rolling on this. And then you see that all over Twitter, people are calling out your company and saying, why did you support this, whatever person who said this about so-and-so? Yeah. And then all of a sudden you get called into HR because they're getting complaints that they don't feel comfortable working for a company that aligns itself with the points of view of, talent A, B, and C. And then your C-suite calls you in and they say, now, why would you put me on a show like this? Why am I having and you've got a communication crisis, and it's because you ran an ad that was going to run every 3 weeks and cost $600, and you never even heard of the show. It was just one of 100 shows you were sponsoring. So, that's where brand safety comes in.
Right, okay.
That's where you go, okay, wait a minute. How do we make sure, look, 2020... we all know what happened, and we all know what corporations are doing now, where the emphasis is. It is very important that brands are showing that they are doing well by doing good, that they are purpose-driven, environmental, social governance, diversity, equity, inclusion. There's a lot of things that companies are now paying attention to, and what's really unique is that, we've been talking about supply chains and carbon footprint and stuff like that. People really haven't been held accountable for what they sponsor so much. And now that's starting to happen. And there's this extra level of accountability where people want us to go, okay, yeah, you're into stakeholder capitalism. That's cool. But why are you sponsoring this, which totally violates everything that you just posted on Instagram about your business and what you support, right?
And it is a fine line to toe, because if you look at the podcast charts, it's the Ben Shapiro's and the Joe Rogans of the world who from time to time upset people, and it's like you have to choose. Do I want to reach the most massive audience, or do I not want to be canceled? It is a fine line to toe.
Well, and add on top of that your job dependent on not on getting customers. And a lot of times, what we've learned over the years, coming out of talk radio, moving into this, and the reason it was such a bonanza for performance marketers is because it really works. And a lot of times when you're tapping into people's passions and feelings and opinions and the future of this country and what does that mean to your family, people respond to the ads that are adjacent to that content. They are engaged. They are fired up. They are emotionally connected to it, and they trust the person who is switching, even if it's awkwardly. They're switching from saying, we need to do this to save this country. And then they turn and they start telling you about Sherry's Berries or whatever. And guess what? Now all of a sudden, Sherry's Berries is saving the country.
Right.
So that's the ecosystem. That's the outrage industrial complex, which I am a part of. I've been in this business a long time, or long enough now, that I have to look at, what's my culpability here? And am I really a values-driven company? Is Oxford Road really a values-driven company? And so what we've been doing over the last couple of years, and really last year is when we really got serious and formal about it, was going, okay, we got two problems going on that are happening on our watch from our corner of the world. Number one, you have a business that thrives on dissension and stirring up discontent, and not just highlighting differences in arguments and perspectives, but basically playing a game of the other guys are bad and we're good, and our job is to defeat them, where we treat other citizens like they're evil because they voted for somebody else. We're perpetuating that, and we're sponsoring that, and we're creating that, and we're publishing that. And we pick a side based on our communities and our own, filter bubble, or whatever you want to call it. And then we feel like we're doing something good, and we feel like we're being righteous because we're judging the other side and pretending like, we don't have our own mess to be accountable for. So that's part one. And then part 2 is then we go, we saw that somebody's not being thoughtful about how they're using their words or decisions from 20 years ago. And then we go, so let's get them. And then there's this mob justice, right? Where you get called out on Twitter. Everybody thinks they got to react in real time. I don't know who started that rumor. You don't have to react in real time. But you think you got to make a statement. You think you got to make permanent decisions about your relationships. It's very, very dangerous. It's very, very difficult. It's not, there's no due process. And so what we wanted to do is look at this whole thing honestly and just go, all right, let's not spin this thing. Let's call it what it is. We and a lot of people are making money by sponsoring damaging content that could be good content if they just presented it in a slightly different way. Let's acknowledge that and bring more attention to evaluating, the reliability and the bias that is baked into a lot of the content that we are consuming and sponsoring. And then meanwhile, let's also be reasonable and say that just because somebody said something about you or something about something you said doesn't mean that we need to disavow our relationship with you forever. Like, we don't have to go on Twitter and condemn you when we were just sponsoring your show 20 minutes ago because somebody called us out for that. Like, can we have a thoughtful process here? Can we have some method of due process where we actually collect facts, investigate facts, suspend judgment, and then come to a reasoned decision that isn't under compulsion because you feel like you have to answer before Huffington Post publishes your name for being affiliated with this talent? Like, let's actually get out of mob justice. This is a boom town, but we need some law, and we need some actual honorable people who are impartial in how they make decisions to help guide us through these situations, because it's very confusing for brands. There's a lot of pressure, and we're all trying to do the right thing, but it's hard to see it clearly. And meanwhile, what we don't realize is that we are poisoning our customers, and we are degrading our trust in institutions in this country, and we're putting the whole democracy at risk.
I mean, and you're preaching obvious truths, and I'm sure when you speak,
and I am preaching. I apologize for that.
No, I didn't mean that in a negative way.
No. I own it. It's real. I'm sorry.
But it's good. But the thing is, that all sounds obviously logical. And I'm sure when you present brand safety and brand marketing to a prospective client, you say all this. But then, and they probably like, you know what, Dan Granger, you're right. Absolutely. Yes. And then all of a sudden, the blank hits the fan, and all of what you said and what you promised them, or not even promised them, but told them was coming. They're like, oh no, what do we get ourselves into? How are you riding this wave right now? Because it is a wave, because it's sort of like out of everyone's control at this point, and you make valid points and arguments. But is it?
How do you get this out of theory and into practice?
Exactly.
Well, and that's the biggest thing. So, like, we started this podcast last year when COVID kicked in because everybody was like paralyzed by fear. And I'm like, okay, we have to speak up and just help advertisers know how to adapt, like how to stick and move in this marketplace. They got a lot of new considerations. Then after George Floyd and kind of moving toward the election, it was like, we got another problem here. And that's that the country's very divided, and like media is playing a part in that. How do we clean it up? And then we launched this initiative called the Media Roundtable that came out of that. And all that we were able to learn from the people, fabulous and fascinating people we got to interview. We started going, okay, how do we move out of just exploration country and out of talking about the problem country, and how do we actually start to come up with practical solutions? So we launched this industry initiative called the Media Roundtable, same name as the podcast. What we're doing is we brought in a bunch of partners to help provide tools and resources, not just for our own clients, but for anybody that wants to help mobilize marketers to advance truth and civility. That's our mission for the thing, and we want to depolarize. So let me talk about some of those practices. Yeah. One thing that we did is we partnered with a group called Ad Fontes Media. Now, they made something called the Media Bias Chart. If you've ever seen the Media Bias Chart, you can just Google it and see a lot of it. Some of it's free, some of it's behind a paywall, but you'll see enough. They've evaluated they rate the news, and they've gone to, like 1,000+ publications, prestigious publications, fringe publications, and they basically take a panel of analysts who are, come from across the political spectrum. So it's not like you're just getting a bunch of groupthink with people with one political persuasion, but they mix them up and they evaluate based on very objective criteria and plot a media source as, how far to the left, how far to the right, how reliable or how unreliable. Is this propaganda? Is this hate speech? Is it verifiable information? Is it original source material? Like, all of that is baked into it. And so on this chart, you can actually look at it as a marketer and go like, all right, I think I want to go north on this chart and help you bake that into my planning process. Well, look, we specialize in podcasts. It's not the only thing we do, but it's the biggest share of what we do. And nothing like this exists. We're all flying blind and going, well, what do you think of the Joe Rogan show? And what do you think of, come on. So what we did was we partnered with Ad Fontes, and they have now evaluated the top 200 news podcasts, and we define news using Apple's criteria. So a lot of it's opinion, politics, stuff like that. It's not like they're all cracking news stories left and right, but whatever falls into that genre, we got 200 of them plotted now. And so what we're doing as an agency first, like we got to eat our own cooking. We're taking our clients and we're assessing, what are your values as a business? Where are you putting your money where your mouth is? Who do you want to be like? Who do you not want to be like? Who are your customers? Just really kind of stepping back and doing a reassessment of brand values and who are you for real? Like, forget the virtue signaling. Like, who are you really and what are you doing about it? And then making sure that we are matching those beliefs with the types of content that we're supporting. And look, that's not perfection, but we are at least minimizing it and using third-party resources so that we can do this in a metric-driven way and create zones. So we've got zones of programs and every zone is custom for every advertiser. This is your green zone, and anything in this green zone, you should advertise unencumbered as long as it meets your other criteria. Yellow, we need to have a conversation because it's worth considering, but there might be problems. Red, we're going to stay away from that. And everybody's is different. So that's one thing that we do. That's for the planning piece so that we can make sure that people's business objectives are aligned with their brand values as you're launching these campaigns. And I'll just say really quickly, the second piece is we give our clients a brand safety handbook that basically says, let's plan ahead. Here's what happens when something slips through the cracks and you get that call or you see that thing on Twitter. We have a step-by-step guide, and we have some of these resources at the Media Roundtable website because we don't want to hold it back from anybody. We think this is important for the industry, for the country, for us as individuals. Like, it's very important stuff. But we want to have that's where the due process comes in. And we advise people on how to come out with your integrity intact and to act quickly to evaluate, but not act quickly to judge. And that's very, very important. And so we have some step-by-step criteria. We have groups that you can partner with to help you in that process to navigate that because it can be very confusing and very sudden. And so we're just trying to give people resources. We're trying to help people be more mindful of what they're putting their money behind so that we can do a little better.
You know, it reminds me, many years ago, I was working with an account executive, as a radio salesperson, and we were just shooting the shit. And I said to him, I'm like, hey, how's it like selling advertising on the AM station, our sister station? They're like, oh, yeah, it's good. It's interesting. I'm like, well, what happens with folks because Rush Limbaugh is on that show? You know, do you get a lot of people calling up trying to advertise on Rush? And they go, well, usually what happens is someone will call and they'll say, I want to advertise on the radio station. And they'll be like, I want to go on Rush. And the salesperson, this is the salesperson of the company, says to him, he goes, you don't want to advertise on Rush. He goes, no. I listen to Rush. I want to advertise on Rush. He goes, okay, just so you know, I'm more than happy to take your money and put your advertising on Rush. But here's what's going to happen. You are going to get two types of phone calls when you start. The first phone call is from another radio station asking you to advertise on their radio station because the people listening most intently to radio commercials are other radio stations. Two will be protesters who will call that say that they will never shop in or buy your product ever again because you're advertising on Rush. Guys, like, No, that's fine. I'm sure it's gonna be okay. I kid you not, within 48 hours of this guy sending his money in to advertise on the radio station, putting his money on Rush, he calls as if his car had broken down in the middle of a highway saying, please get my commercials off of Rush Limbaugh. I'm getting called all day and night from people. So it's just so funny how as much as things change, they never change.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I was working at KFI 640 in LA when Rush had his peak kind of controversial moment, and we carried him. And so I was definitely in that boat, and that was transformative for me. It was really my first rodeo with this stuff. Now we have like micro versions of it every day, but that was the big one, right? And here's what was interesting is they started researching who these people were that were calling in and saying they were not going to ever do business with you again and threatening the brands. And number one, they weren't real customers. There were a lot of fictitious accounts on social media. There were people that were actually getting paid to make those calls and to stir it up and to antagonize the advertisers to get him, removed from his affiliates. And I think that when they started exposing that, it started to die down, and then really it stopped being a problem after a couple years. But for a long time, there was a lot of antagonism. And by the way, this is part of my problem with the industry. Rush, may he rest in peace. Rush may not have embodied all of the values of the Media Roundtable, which we post and are specific about. That being said, there should be a process for evaluating that. And we do want advertisers to know, well, listen, when you affiliate with this program, here's what you're affiliating with, and you have to decide if that measures up with your values or not. And that's cool. Like, that's important, and that's the work that we should be doing. But what I don't like is when you got a bunch of paid antagonizers who have one objective in their day, and that is to simulate 100 people that they allegedly represent. I mean, we were getting local letters to our local affiliate for Rush complaining from people who didn't live in the coverage area. So it was like, this is not legitimate. And Twitter is a bathroom wall, as Dave Chappelle says. Like, you can't trust that just because people are complaining about something on Twitter that it's actually legitimate. So like, that's where the due process part really has to come in as well. We want people to go in eyes wide open to what they're doing, and we don't want them to put their content that is in clear conflict with the values that they believe and have told people they stand for as a business. But if that's not the case, like, let's have some protocols and give people the benefit of the doubt and not just listen to people that may be incentivized to be attacking you.
As a news junkie, Twitter to me is my favorite social media platform. I just love it. I mean, as someone who's worked in media pretty much my entire adult life, it's like it is the perfect application. I always like to tell people, as much as I love Twitter, I know that Twitter really is what you make of it. To me, I only follow prestigious news organizations, people I know, media people that I follow. But if you decide to follow these other people who are, like you said, these fake antagonizers, these ragers who are just basically just on there just to do, that's what Twitter is. And that's unfortunate because Twitter is not always real life. And especially as you see with the cancel culture, it's like, it's not, if you were to walk down the street, a person wouldn't walk up to that another person and say, hey, you suck. No one would ever do that. But because Twitter's not real life, they can say, hey, I could say whatever I want about this person. I think that's what companies really need to start doing, and just realizing that this isn't real life. That's an important facet for a lot of these companies to just get through. And you made a lot of valid points. Just like, hey, listen, there's no need to instantly react to something that just happened. Let it breathe. The old radio term. Let it breathe a little bit. Let's see what happens and see if this really is real. If the people start showing up outside of your office building, maybe then it starts to get a little real. But this faux rage is something that we just really have to get a handle on, and I just don't know when it's going to subside. It's just like the McCarthy era. That eventually ended, but I don't know when this era will end. Hopefully sooner than later.
Well, and that's what we're working on is like, it was really interesting. So like I told you, the podcast for me was a great opportunity to work out my own thoughts on this because I didn't know what to do with cancel culture. Some people say there is no cancel culture. Stop complaining. And then some people are like, cancel culture is ruining everything. And so, one of the interviews we did was with Keith Allred, who's the director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. I'm like, what do you think about cancel culture? Because his job is to like bring people together from both sides. And he's like, look, let's acknowledge something. We all have a limit to what we will tolerate, what we will accept. We have to draw the line somewhere. We had to do that with Hitler and say, okay, if you go past this point, we're going to intervene. And so that's very natural. Now, the problem is that we all draw our lines in different places, and sometimes there's a lot of groupthink and mob mentality. I don't think that we need to get rid of accountability, and there are certainly a lot of valid, legitimate reasons that some people do need to be canceled. But I think what we started to see when we're all in this like emotional reactive state so much last year is it was happening too fast, and there wasn't always consideration or like an adherence to standards that had been clearly communicated to people that were on the other side of it, right? And so I think it's gonna get worked out over time, but we all have to like help work it out. Like, I don't think it's just gonna solve itself. I think we just need to keep having this conversation and acknowledge it is good for you to support what you believe in, but you have to, talk is cheap, and you really need to be ready to bleed for what you're going to say. Don't just say it. The sooner we can get over this like quick to judgment thing and this naivete that believes that like there's people with black hats and white hats and it's like this is a Western, like this is kids in a sandbox. This is not the way adults behave, and like we just need to lower it a little bit. We just need to lower the temperature and like give each other the benefit of the doubt and not default to a position of they're wrong, I'm right. I think we can do a lot better. And I think that marketers and content creators and brands can make a really big impact because, when have humans ever had so much content that we're feeding our minds all the time that is brainwashing us, that makes us think that there has to be one side that's right and one side that's wrong all the time, and that all these like neighbors and family members and fellow citizens and friends are our enemies. Like, we have to evolve beyond that thinking and not be so binary. And I really think that changing what we sponsor and being known by what we support and not necessarily who we throw under the bus is a lot more powerful and a lot more sustainable. And we think about sustainability in other areas. We need to start thinking about it in terms of communication. And so for those of us that are in the communication business, brokering, creating, sponsoring, the Media Roundtable is here to help provide some support as you move down that path.
I love it. And, lastly on this, it is funny with the cancel culture. The one thing that drives me crazy about the whole use of the word cancel culture is that people don't always know what it means. So they throw it around. Like, I remember when Governor Cuomo was going through the charges of harassment. He goes, "This is cancel culture." I'm like, no, it's not. What are you talking about? That's not. It's not cancel culture. No. And you'll see politicians use that's cancel culture. I'm like, not really. That person said something really horrible and demeaning. That's not cancel culture.
If you broke the law, if you violated a policy in your employment contract, this is life, and there needs to be accountability for stuff. Nobody's trying to get away from that, but then people get carried away, right? Because it becomes a power grab. So it's like, and so personally, I look at both sides, and I'm just like, okay, I start from the presupposition that everybody's a little bit wrong and a little bit right. And let's not pretend that somebody's got a lock on either of them.
That's awesome. Dan, before we go, if folks are listening, they want to get a hold of Oxford Road and find out more about what you're doing and how you're doing it, what's the best way to do it?
All right, so we got a few different things. So buckle up.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes, but go ahead and run it down.
If you need an agency, you go to oxfordroad.com, and if you want to just dip your toe in, sign up for the Influencer, which is our weekly newsletter on the business. Everybody should sign up for the Influencer. If you're not looking for an ad agency or a partner to work this out with, go to Media Roundtable and first of all, listen to the podcast. Like, we just closed the season, did a couple recap episodes that'll give you a nice sampler platter and see some of the conversations we've been. I mean, we had everybody. We had Ben Smith at the New York Times. We talked to Bill O'Reilly. We talked to people all over the spectrum, people you love, people you hate, people you violently disagree with, but really will help you form your thoughts and hopefully entertain you in the process. download it wherever you get your podcast, wherever you're listening to this, and go to the Media Roundtable and see how you can get involved in the cause, because that really matters.
Awesome.
And let's see if we can get the country back on track.
His name is Dan Granger. He's the founder and CEO of Oxford Road. Dan, it's been a lot of fun chatting with you. Great commiserating about radio and the way podcasting is going. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
And that is all for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.